Okay, joining us now, Sandy Hudson of Black Lives Matter Canada. She's currently based in LA, and she joins us from there. And Darren Thompson, he's the national correspondent with Native News Online, and he's joining us from his base in Arizona. So thank you guys both for joining us today. You know, I want to, I'll start with you, Sandy. I want to ask you both this question. You know, the first things that popped into your head when that verdict was read. Sandy?
Oh man, I had prepared myself the morning because I had a feeling that the verdict was going to come down quite quickly. So I had a full slate of things to do that day. But as we do when these sorts of things happen, people in the Black community, and I'm sure people in the Indigenous community as well, I had to prepare myself for being able to function normally throughout the day, knowing what could happen. There was no preparation that worked. I still felt awful and quite hollow, which, perhaps that might be surprising to folks who are not Black or not Indigenous, who might think that such a verdict would just, make me happy. But it doesn't. It doesn't. It just leaves me feeling hollow because you look at the bar that needed to be crossed to say that this man needed to be held accountable. It had to be caught on video. It had to be how long. It's just an enormous bar, and nothing about a conviction leads to the end of the cycle. It just means that we're waiting for the next person who's going to be killed by police, which in this case was on that very same day, a 15-year-old girl, Micaiah Bryant, in Ohio.
Yeah. Darren, I'm curious, as that verdict is read, what were your thoughts? What went through your mind?
Well, my thoughts were, thank goodness the system worked in this particular situation. It was a sense of relief because I believe the city, as well as the rest of the world, was not exactly prepared for the outcome if a not guilty verdict were to come. And I say that to say, in the city of Minneapolis alone, which is where the trial was held, there were thousands of National Guard troopers on standby in the event of a not guilty verdict, because there were a lot of organizers, a lot of actions, and a lot of activity regarding calling for justice for this man, as well as to address the overall system of policing in the United States.
Yeah. I know what you were saying, Sandy, about that numb feeling there was when the verdict was read. I felt nothing, really. It was like this, because this is what it should have been. So I feel like I'm not going to afford myself some joy when that's exactly how it should have been. We watched the guy do it, right? And then I was kind of a little bit taken aback by how many people were jubilant at this guilty verdict. And it just kind of made me look and go, maybe these people just all think it's all done. Like, we've washed our hands of it and we can all walk away. So I totally get what you're saying. And then that preparing for what if not, and having to wear that for the day too. Like, what if he gets off? Then we're right back to, what we all kind of know to be the case, right? Darren, I wanted to ask you, so you were based in the Twin Cities when all of this went down last Memorial Day in the middle of the pandemic. Take us back to watching this movement. So the George Floyd is killed. This Black Lives Matter movement starts building. There was a lot of twists and turns and evolutions, and it ballooned in the span of a year. And you've been covering this. So, just kind of, I'm curious, notes from the reporter sort of thing, how you clocked it.
Sure. Well, this metro area has a poor history in interactions with people of color, of course, with law enforcement, and this wasn't the first situation. And as I discussed before, with the pandemic in its beginning stages, just started to ease up a bit, even though numbers were still remarkably high. I believe that people were becoming hopeful because of the increasing weather temperatures. And as a result of that, there was more activity. And, this was the unofficial kickoff of summer in the United States, of Memorial Day weekend. And sure enough, a Black man was recorded being knelt on by a white police officer that resulted in his death. And as a result of that, it led to many people in the streets. I think a lot of that had to do with the pandemic. I think a lot of people were frustrated with inactivity happening and arguments happening on partisan levels in the United States and in the state of Minnesota about what were the next best steps to deal with the pandemic. And then on top of that, you have, another killing by a police officer to a person of color. And of course, the video speaks for itself. And that was, I actually didn't watch the video in its entirety for several days after it happened. Unfortunately, this is a pretty regular thing in this part of the country, and it was a really traumatic thing just to see. And then I didn't need to see it to believe it per se, and feeling the energy and feeling the people's voices in the streets was why I continue to take to the streets, as well as to cover this particular story from a variety of lenses. And I think that it was a very remarkable story to cover, as well as a very historical event that had happened in not only in this country but throughout the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it took you, this wasn't just about what's happening in Minneapolis, right? And this wasn't just about Black Lives Matter or Indigenous Lives Matter. Then it got to dial it back to contact. We've got problems with the statues now, right? All of these things sort of just came out of building on the other. I have to ask you, Sandy, watching from Canada, I have to say it was bizarre to see how people divided on this issue. The response to Black Lives Matter being Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. It was shocking to see. I'm like, well, where the hell is all of this coming from? Like, aren't we just here talking about what we just saw happen? Like, somebody made the comparison. Of course, all lives matter, but, just like all houses matter. But if your house is on fire, or if their house is on fire, you're going to go and you want the firefighters to go put that one out. It's not about your house, which is safe and sound right now. So I like that comparison. But, as you're in the States and you're watching this, Sandy, did it shock you at all? Because, you walk differently in this world than I do. Obviously, I look like a white lady. And then secondly, what does it tell us about America?
I thought that this year was a little bit different than we had seen in years previous. I've been involved in Black Lives Matter since its inception in 2013, and we've seen so much of exactly what you're talking about over the years. This all lives matter, the blue lives matter, the are you Black supremacists? Ridiculous responses to this very simple affirmation that should be non-threatening. Black lives matter. Why would that be a threatening phrase to anybody unless they recognize that something has to change in the way that our society is structured in order for that to be not just an affirmation, but a societal truth. And I think that, some folks had a deep-seated fear about that, and that's where we saw some of those responses. Now, I say that this year was different because it seemed like summer 2020, we really broke through that. All of a sudden, it became really popular to say Black Lives Matter. The WNBA started a trend of folks in the sports arena and entertainment, claiming the phrase and saying it. And we were seeing it become popularized even in corporate America and beyond, which, none of us activists were really expecting. What I think we have an issue with today remaining is that it's not just an affirmation. It's a call to action to change our society. So then the next 3 words that were starting to become controversial is defund the police. We're not just saying Black Lives Matter so that you can say it and put it on a shirt and get some clout and get everybody to know that, hey, you think the situation is bad too. We are saying we want society to change. You have to take some sort of action. And the resistance to that piece is really, really dangerous. We need to change society. If we are going to get rid of this cycle of just waiting for the next death, waiting for the next crisis, I don't want to do that anymore. I can't do that anymore. I can't live through that. As Darren said, it took him some time to watch the video. I didn't see the George Floyd video until the trial. I just couldn't. I could not bring myself to watch it. And it's awful to exist in this place where you're just waiting for the next thing because society refuses to reckon with the way that it is set up, such that it continues this cycle of abuse and violence against Black people.
You had actually told me something that I did not know, that there's these 2 kind of acts that have come out of this. There's the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, and then there's the Breathe Act. If you could just give us a quick rundown, like what's the difference? Because one is we've kind of, seems like we've already tried, and then one is completely new. If you could take a stab at explaining that, dumbing it down for us.
Yeah, I mean, you put it so well. One has already been tried. And so a lot of people, I think, in Canadian media over the last week will have heard of the Justice and Policing Act. It is the one that is named after George Floyd and is the one that I think has some deep, deep fundamental flaws. It, if passed, will send hundreds of millions of dollars into policing for training, anti-bias training, for body cameras, for the elimination or like the regulation of the way that police do chokeholds, so making certain types banned. And what we know is that those measures don't work. The chokehold that was used by a police officer to murder Eric Garner in New York was banned. Didn't matter. Still killed him. Derek Chauvin was looking into a camera as he killed George Floyd. Yeah. Didn't matter. Still killed him. Anti-bias training, I mean, come on. There's no amount of hour-long trainings that would have stopped Derek Chauvin from murdering George Floyd and all of these other people who have experienced this violence at the hands of police. Anti-bias training has been being given to police for decades now. It doesn't make an impact. Now, the Breathe Act, what it tries to do is to remove funding from the police and put that funding into different measures of creating safety and security in our society. So that might mean a new emergency service for people who are experiencing mental health crises, or providing new services for people who are experiencing gender-based violence or domestic violence, which is an issue that the police hardly do well at even responding to right now. That's the kind of thing that we haven't tried, taking power away from the police to enact their violence against members of our community by defunding them and putting that funding into better methods of creating safety. Well,
and I want to get into the defunding element of all of this, which I've always kind of felt was a really sort of unfortunate marketing label that's been put on it, because I think it shuts out a lot of people who otherwise, if they knew what it was all about, they might be more inclined to listen and understand and to support it. We have, I think, something here. We've got a show, or we've got a story here on defunding the police. I think it was, this one is out of, this is from the gained momentum here in Canada, the June 2020 shooting of Chantal Moore out in the East Coast. This happened, but when the RCMP went to conduct a wellness check So I wanted to just take a look back at that story, and it was kind of how, defund the police movement really sort of flourished here. And up to this point, it had just been, we'd been watching it down south of the border. Take a look.
A lone sign that Friday's Black Lives Matter protest in Ottawa has a list of names and a call to action at the bottom of it. One that a Vancouver-based advocate agrees with.
I think, again, we could see this shift from what we have right now, which is police attending crisis calls. In the cases of Chantal Moore and Reggie Krichinsky-Paquette, they were attending, doing wellness checks, and they obviously weren't able to support the wellness, right? These women died.
Meenakshi Mano spoke about defunding Vancouver police at this town hall a year ago. She's a police accountability critic for the Pivot Legal Society and believes huge police budgets spent elsewhere would reduce crime.
If we were to redistribute funds from policing into better welfare rates, basic income rates, could we start to see like a downstream trend towards low-level property crimes?
Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchette and Conservative leader Andrew Scheer were both asked about this idea.
So adding resources to fight racism is something. Reducing the resources provided to police corps is something else, which might make our communities somewhat more vulnerable.
I don't believe that defunding the RCMP would make Canadians safer. I believe that we have to look at aspects within our police forces and stamp out systemic racism where it exists and put in measures to ensure that nobody is mistreated or treated differently.
Mano doesn't buy those arguments.
So when we hear, political leaders say that this is actually going to contribute to a lack of safety, I'm thinking about how people are dying, right, at the hands of police or shortly after being in police custody. That, to me, speaks of a lack of safety.
Prime Minister Trudeau wasn't asked specifically about defunding the police, but said his government has brought in, among other things, new oversight of the RCMP and promised to do more. Paul Lamoran, APTN National News, Ottawa.
So, Sandy, I've got a bunch of questions here for Darren, but I just want to finish up with Sandy about the defunding police. How do you explain this concept to somebody who would think that defunding the police means that you don't have protection? And it's, of course, probably the people who think like that are people who don't live in impoverished neighborhoods, don't have, they're white-skinned. It's not their kids that are dying in these interactions with police. How do you explain to these people, though, what defunding the police actually entails and how it would work and how it doesn't take anything from them? It doesn't mean that the police aren't there when you phone 911 because someone's breaking into your house. How do you explain it?
Yeah, I mean, to so many people, the police are a theoretical concept. They're not a force that they interact with on a daily basis. For other folks, people of Black communities and a lot of Indigenous communities will be interacting with police all the time. And so they actually have an idea beyond what Hollywood tells us of what the police actually do. And so for all your listeners, I will say that Black Lives Matter Canada has created a resource so that people can really understand what we mean when we're talking about this. It's called defundthepolice.org, and we encourage you to take a look because there's lots of different information there. But the biggest thing that is useful for us to understand as part of this is the role that the police actually play in our society. We might think that they are the force that's there to respond to every call, every robbery, to solve crime, to make sure that we're safe, because that's what we see on television. But the reality is that that is actually not how police operate, and it can be jarring to see the numbers and accept that truth. So for an example, most people won't know this, but this is a Statistics Canada statistic, that upwards of 80% of what the police deal with are non-criminal calls in nature, most of those being mental health calls. So why is it that the number one emergency response that we have for people who are going through a mental health crisis is police? They don't deal with those crises well. Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi, another Indigenous man who was killed on the East Coast, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, DeAndre Campbell, these are all people who were experiencing a mental health crisis when police killed them. We need to take all of the billions of dollars that we put into police and take some of that money to create a new emergency service that's going to deal with mental health. Yeah. Even things like robbery, theft, and arson, the police are solving in those cases very few of those so-called crimes, right? Like the police lay a charge in less than 20% of those issues. Less than 20%. Your insurance company is more useful to you.
It's time to redistribute the how we're dealing with these things. I get the point. Like yes, when you get into it makes sense to me. But it was that initial label is takes people aback.
I think also, though, it's not just redistributing, it's getting to the root of the problem. Because if the root of the problem is that people are, for example, poor or don't have proper housing, let's put the money into that to make sure that those things don't happen. And I will say, in terms of the naming of the campaign, Defund the Police, we've been trying different names since 2013. We tried Reinvest, didn't take on. Retool, didn't take on. Divest, didn't take on. It wasn't until we said defund that somehow people started talking about it. So I would come back at you and say, I think this is one of the most effective campaign languages that we have come up with, because we're actually having the conversation now, whereas before everyone was ignoring us.
Yeah. Well, you're right. Here we are having this conversation. Darren, I want to ask you, you're an Indigenous man living in the States. You now have an Indigenous woman, Deb Haaland, in cabinet there. What do you anticipate the effect is going to be on the situation that you have in the U.S.?
The effect as in having an Indigenous woman in the cabinet?
Yeah, is this gonna change anything? Because I mean, there's massive race divisions there, and seemingly people not willing to acknowledge that there is systemic racism within various facets of your country. Can Deb Haaland make a difference?
Sure, great question, and there's a great example. As her role as Madam Secretary, Deborah Haaland's first action was she created a collaborative initiative with the Department of Justice, which is a separate department here in the States, to address the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so that, of course, was partnered with the Department of Interior, which overall oversees Indian lands as well as Indian trust lands, which is a pretty significant percentage of geographical landscape here in the United States. So starting from there, depending on what the statistics and how they are revealed, I believe there will be additional changes as well as trainings provided on various jurisdictional challenges as well as policing, in particular Indian country. And that's the challenge here in the United States, is that according to the United States Census Bureau, the majority of Indigenous people live off of Indian land. In other words, they live in cities, and most of the cities here in the United States are not particularly on trust land or are on Indian reservations. And so there's the challenge, and of course disseminating the data as well as looking through it and then determining what type of actions or interactions that law enforcement has with people who identify as Indigenous and or Native American. So, you have those challenges, and I think that looking at this data, I think, will be something that will be addressed, particularly with the new Census Bureau being taken, and it just was released here in the United States a few weeks ago, and that is going through some changes in regards to who sits in Congress and, different political representation here in the United States. And I definitely think that with the re-implementation of the Tribal Nations Summit with President Biden, I think that there will be some additional changes with the Department of Interior as well as the Department of Justice here in the United States.
Well, I'm going to have to cut you guys off there. We have to take a break, but I'm hopeful that we have a lot to be looking forward to in terms of action to come out of this. Thank you guys both for joining us.